Okay, thank you everybody. During the video, Kai, who featured in his new role as a film star, said to me, I don't think we need to say anything, it's all in the video. So I am going to try to present with Kai some of the background to the summary that you've just seen in that video, and reinforce the key messages that came through in the video, because essentially that text is pretty much the conclusions of our rather more laborious presentation that we're about to embark on. So what's going to happen now is that Kai and I are going to do a double act to present the findings of our study, but more from the perspective of the final report of the study, which is this thing here, that you can download from the website, should you be interested enough to do so. Okay, so to start with then, let's just reflect a little bit about what's the point of this whole exercise? What is the point of having trade union prevention agents in micro and small firms? As it said on the video, micro and small firms are actually almost 99% of the firms in Europe, and they employ almost half of the European workforce. And when it comes to health and safety, what we find is a very, very mixed picture indeed, with lots and lots of paradoxes. There are obviously good practices in small firms as there are in large firms. There are good reasons for why somebody a long time ago coined the phrase, small is beautiful. But it's not beautiful everywhere, that's for sure. And there's plenty of evidence of poor health and safety practices, poor management practices, poor conditions of work, and exploitation of workers in the micro and small firm sector. So this very mixed picture, where you can always find good and bad examples, is partly explained, indeed I would suggest is mostly explained, by the heterogeneity of the nature of small firms, their composition, their practices, and so forth. But for a substantial proportion of these firms, the general and multifaceted lack of resources determines poor occupational health and safety. And it's a result not just of what goes on within the small firm, but the wider social, economic, regulatory and labour relations frames in which these micro and small firms are embedded in society. And importantly, these are the things that current structural changes in European Union economies are exacerbating, making worse. Okay? I'll return to that later. And with the result that a substantial proportion of the work in micro and small firms takes place in workplaces that pursue what other studies have referred to as low-road survival strategies, and they're found in high-risk industries. And just to quote from a report that uses this example, which I'll return to, a low-road survival strategy is one where a weak economic position, low investment in health and safety, limited knowledge, awareness and competence of owner-managers, limited capacity to manage systematically, their attitudes and priorities, concerns for economic survival, all work together to determine low uptake of preventive arrangements in a substantial proportions of small firms that exist in hazardous industries. And in addition to this, these firms occupy positions of structural vulnerability in supply chains where they are subject to cost and delivery, price pressures, and competition from others in the same position as they are. So there's a massive turnover in the very existence of these firms. And the workers within them often, but not always, have low skills, low pay, very limited trade unionism, and very limited employment security. And undocumented and illegal work is very common in this sector. Again, all of this in combination leads to poor health and safety awareness and poor health and safety management. There are also greater risks and poor OSH outcomes compared with larger firms. It's said in the video, and the research confirms this, that when you take account of all the other variables, the incidence of serious and fatal injuries in small firms is greater than in their large firm equivalents. So small firms, he says much greater, okay, much greater than in their larger equivalents. So in that sense, small is definitely not beautiful, and I would suggest that all of the reasons I've just outlined explain why that is the situation. And when you turn to prevention, what you often find, which Kai also alluded to in the video, is that when small firms talk about prevention, what they're actually talking about is workers assuming responsibility for the failings of the firm as a whole to address their protection. In other words, it's about workers looking after themselves, workers taking care of themselves, workers accepting the risks that come with the job and agreeing with the employer's strategy that they should do so. And that's a very significant problem in relation to improving prevention in those firms. So, what works? And what I'm going to do now is just reflect on some of the wider research that's been undertaken on micro and small firms, not in this project, but in more recent but wider-ranging projects. The general conclusions from the wider look at what goes on in micro and small firms argue that regulation and the enforcement of regulation remain important drivers of good practice in small firms. There are problems, as again the video alluded to, in the reach of that regulation and enforcement. But that's not an argument for the removal of the regulation. It remains a very key, important element to good practice in small firms. And when you look at the help that small firms have received in the European Union in general, you find that there are many, many voluntary programs and tools and instruments which are designed to help micro and small firms to improve their health and safety. But you also find that the uptake of this array of support that exists is generally focused on quite a relatively small proportion of micro and small firms. Analysts who have looked at health and safety in small firms generally do a very, very quick kind of categorization of these firms into 3 different categories of behavior as far as the behavior of their owner managers are concerned. They talk about them as being avoiders, reactors, or learners in terms of their character. And the terms speak for themselves. The learners are the ones who want to improve, have the resources to take advantage of the tools that are available to help them to improve. The avoiders, on the other hand, would rather not confront their regulatory responsibilities, and while the reactors are the group that do, to some extent, confront these responsibilities, but only when they are obliged to. And in terms of the proportions of these firms, roughly speaking, the majority of micro and small firms probably fall into the category of reactors. And then at either end, you've got a bunch of those who we would categorize as avoiders, and at the other end, you have the learners. And the point I'm trying to make here is that all of the efforts, and they are quite considerable, all of the efforts to help owner-managers in micro and small firms tend to focus on the learners, and it is the learners who take up these opportunities. So basically, like regulation and enforcement, they often miss the vast bulk of the ones that would benefit from these types of things. And finally, many of these schemes are introduced as pilot programs, and they're terminated when the funding for them ends. So they're not really terribly sustainable, which again is another big problem for micro and small firms in general. And as Kai pointed out in the video, when all of this is taken into account, the most successful interventions usually involve some form of face-to-face contact with some kind of agent from outside of the small firm that is able to influence the attitudes and behaviors of the owner-managers and the workers too. Okay, so whether it's a regulatory inspector, whether it's a health and safety practitioner, whether it's a representative from a company that's trying to sell the small firm some helpful tool, whether it's the small firm's bank manager or their auditors or their accountants, or even the spouses of the owner-managers themselves, whoever it is, it's that contact with the face-to-face contact with the change agent that reinforces the message that brings about the change. That's what the wider research evidence indicates. And that's one of the reasons, one of the key reasons why tupis are actually in the frame as being important in this whole exercise of bringing about change in micro and small firms. And in most of the wider research then comes to the conclusion that action is required to increase effectiveness and reach for the hard to reach and the more vulnerable of the micro and small firms. And in this respect, wider research also shows that the resources available to support what works in all of the countries in Europe that have been studied, the conclusion is that it's too limited to reach out and make a difference for the great majority of micro and small firms. So it's a key issue that needs to be addressed, because most of these firms do not themselves seek out information or take action on health and safety voluntarily. Nevertheless, recent studies, and I'm referring particularly to the ones of the European Agency on Safety and Health in Bilbao, recent studies argue that efficiency could be improved by the development and better coordination of strategies, and although more resources are needed to achieve a widespread impact, this idea of coordinating, orchestrating multiple strategies is the kind of current flavour of the month amongst researchers and, to some extent, some policymakers in terms of moving forward in relation to health and safety in small firms. And as I will argue later, this is very important in relation to tupis, because tupis can play a very significant role in that process of coordinated and orchestrated impact. And just to reinforce this, if you look at current European Union policies on health and safety and social rights generally, you do find mention of micro and small firms. You do find some recognition in these policies that something needs to be done, that these firms do require some enhancement of their capacity to deal with risk prevention. They do need to be taken account of when you are planning regulatory interventions, not just to deregulate, but to actually regulate more appropriately. And as I said, the current strategies and policies from the European Union do provide some indication of an awareness at that level that these sorts of things should be happening. And again, it's my understanding that one of the reasons for that has been the pressure that has come from trade unions at that level to try to ensure the inclusion of these kinds of things in European social policy. So what I'm trying to say here is that, you know, there's never a perfect time for doing this, but it would seem to me that there is a moment here, an historical moment, where perhaps some greater form of pressure at the national level can be applied, working on a platform that is somehow or other in evidence at the European level. Perhaps I'm a little optimistic, but there you are. What I want to turn to now, finally, is what we actually went about doing in the present project. As will be obvious from the video, we looked at tupis actions in a number of different countries. In fact, we had a project group that was looking at actions in 5 countries, although in one of them we didn't find very many, so we focused in the video on 4 of them. But initially we set out not only to explore what was going on in Spain, in Sweden, in Italy, and in the UK, but also in Poland as well. And we had a research team drawn from these countries, eminent and distinguished colleagues who are here in this room, and we got some funding, as Valeria has described, from a European Commission budget that supports social dialogue. And we had an initial research workshop, which ISTAS hosted in Madrid, and we planned out the project, we produced some study protocols, and we decided that each country would produce a national report identifying relevant initiatives, but more importantly, also describing their national economic, regulatory, policy and social contexts, because we argued amongst ourselves that these were really important in understanding how these things worked. So that's what happened. And we also reviewed the relevant literature, and we drew heavily on the European Agency study, which is called the Sesame study, and you can find it on the European Agency's website if you're interested. But we also drew quite extensively from a previous ETUC study carried out nearly 20 years ago, looking at what was happening then in relation to exactly the same issue, and actually in mostly exactly the same countries. So that was useful as background. And as a result, as a research team, we agreed the schemes to be studied in greater detail. We all went off and did that, and fed back the results. And then we held a second research workshop in Rome, which was very nice in the spring, to discuss the findings from the national studies, which then Kai and I went away and drafted a draft comparative European report, analysing the experiences and trying to compare the experiences in terms of what works and in what context it works from across the countries that we studied, and also trying to put it in a wider setting in terms of looking at the regulatory and economic and other influences that determine those kinds of outcomes. And in addition to the report, Valeria and her team in ISTAS worked on producing a leaflet and the short film that you've just seen on the findings and experiences of tupis. So that was essentially the background and the methods that we used in this study. And the idea in this presentation was, at this point, I was going to hand over to my film star colleague here, who was going to talk about the findings very briefly in the 5 countries.
Is this on?
Have I got to mine off?
Yeah. Okay. Look, I have 5 slides here of the countries, and they are nearly, literally, exactly the same which I've told in the video, so I'll skip them. If you push B, there, Walter, David, then it gets black. If you put, because I'm not going to talk about them. B. Yeah, of course you have a good letter B. Yes, you succeeded. So I'll use very shortly say 2 different things. One major aspect of the background. Why are tupis important? Because that wasn't emphasized enough. Well, the reality is that we're living in the European Union. David are still, and we hope you might continue. Who knows? Anyhow, and European Union, not alone, but definitely very much European Union, is graying. The balance between those who work and who produce and those who are too young and too old to work is deteriorating, which is a serious demographic and economic issue. At the same time, as we mentioned, small firms, not because they are evil, because generally they are not. Small firm managers are normal, decent people. Some are not so decent and some are saints. But most of them are normal, decent people. But still, their poor health and safety management is eroding the health and therefore the workability of a large and a growing share of the labor force of the European Union. At the same time, as we need to prolong working life, this means that the poor health and safety management of small firms in the European Union is a serious economic strategic issue for the welfare state all across the European Union. So I would say that tupis and things like this are by far not only in union interest. It recognized or not, it is a great strategic interest for the European Union and for the governments in the various union states. If these arguments are listened to, I don't know, but that's the economic reality. That's one thing. And then secondly, on these 5 slides, which I described shortly, and we will hear later on in the national presentations, what should be emphasized is what we found is that Britain, Sweden, Italy, and Spain are quite different countries with their different national settings, different regulations, different industrial relations traditions. But the way the tupis operated was amazingly similar. Wherever they were effective, they were, let's say, they were quite systematic. I'm not talking about formalistic, but it means that the unions had more or less careful selection of persons who are experienced and capable of interacting with manager and gave them good enough training. And then in the operations, there is more or less systematic planning, not just going around by hazard to any other workplaces, but it's systematic planning of where you go and why and how you coordinate and so on. And when tupis enter the workplaces, there is more or less clearly systematic manner of how do you initiate the dialogue. You go directly to introduce yourself to a manager, present why you're here and what's your role and what's the task. And then you proceed to check out documents and check out the workplaces, talk with the workers and so on. And then afterwards, you have a more or less systematic checklist or whatever report to write up, so you can keep tab on what's happening. And this is what was occurred in the large-scale British trials 20 years ago, and this is what's happening in Spain, Italy, and Sweden today. And this is what works. And I think this is what enough to say for this for the moment.
So, I'm going to say the same sort of thing, but in a rather different way.
Okay.
So, going on what... Thank you. Okay? Yeah. Going on what we discovered in the research in the 5 countries that we looked at, it confirmed much of what we already knew, actually, from previous research. And when applied specifically to tupis, in no particular order here, some of the things that emerged, first and foremost, in terms of the sequence of the slides at least, the importance of a regulatory steer. Not all of the countries that have tupis have such a regulatory steer, but where regulation exists, it does save an awful lot of hard negotiating on the part of the supporters of tupis schemes to get them onto the practice of the supports for small firms. So we found in Sweden and also present in Italy a provision within the regulation for something like tupis. That was critical to the success of the schemes in those countries, and although it was absent from the other countries in the study, and indeed is absent from the majority of EU member states, I think one of the conclusions of our comparative report is that if it were present, it would be an enormous benefit. So that's important. The second demonstration of what is very important is commitment and action from trade unions, embedding their strategies for tupis in the organising priorities that they have, as well as in their health and safety strategies, and as well as in their strategies in relation to micro and small firms. All these things need to come together. And in the countries where we have evidence of successful tupis actions, that is what happens. There is evidence that the unions are doing this to some extent, at least. And arguably, this gives a very, very important support for both initiating and sustaining these kinds of actions. Then the third really critical issue, tupis don't exist in an economic vacuum. They exist in the real world, and therefore they require some real resourcing. To get people to be able to carry out the activities that tupis carry out requires resourcing. And this is a critical issue. We have many examples of TUPAS schemes that have been successful but which no longer exist. The primary reason why they no longer exist is because there hasn't been the political will to provide the resourcing to enable them to exist, either through state support or through voluntary agreements or both. Those schemes that are successful have such resourcing, and it is a critical element in their success. That said, that doesn't mean that they're not cost effective. I think if you look at the way that they operate, and I think this is a point that Kai has also alluded to, they are a very important contribution to the economy, in fact. The problem is that the economy is often not evaluated in that way, and so their importance is lost. But that is true of most prevention strategies anyway. And it is what we're talking about is some kind of political refocusing of what is truly important in society. And we can come back to that later. But the key message to take from this is that without resourcing, it is very difficult to see how a TUPAS scheme can either be successful or, more importantly, that success, how it can be sustained. There's a table on this slide which you won't be able to read, but it is in the report, and it just shows we've done the work, because what we've done in this table is taken the 5 countries that we focused on, and we've looked at the kinds of support that exists in those countries for the necessary schemes, and we've documented the type of support and where the support comes from and where the financing comes from. If you want to look at it in more detail, you can download it from the website. But it does show very clearly that in the 3 countries where these schemes are most prominent, Italy, Spain and Sweden, there is financial support for their activities, and that support has sustained what we've seen. And in other countries, that financial support is largely absent. So when you do get schemes in those other countries, like in the UK, for example, they are sustained only by the efforts of the unions that are behind them, and they are limited in what they can achieve because of that financial restriction. So, the video and Kai have also made the point that, again, this is not really sustainable if it is only unilateral action from trade unions. There does need to be engagement from other institutional actors with the TUPAS schemes. You see that engagement through bipartite and tripartite agreements between unions and other institutional actors, whether they're employers' organizations, micro and small firms organizations, regional and local government agencies, regulatory authorities, social insurance organizations, OSH practitioners, and other related interests. There's a whole range of them that are active in one way or another in the schemes that we have looked at. And they're important. They're important to gain the will for the action, and sometimes also to gain the financial arrangements to make the actions possible. So we can't really ignore that. And also a major support for success is the sectoral, regional and local focus of these schemes. One of the reasons why TUPAS are successful is because they are actually perceived as being relevant to the needs of the workplaces that they investigate. And structurally, tripartite and tripartite structures already in existence, such as the ones that we found in Italy with the bilaterali. My Italian is dreadful, so my apologies. But those kinds of structures are really very, very important. And the role of collective agreements, again, fundamental to the success of these kinds of activities. So TUPAS, to be successful, what I'm trying to say here is not just what goes on in the small firm or the micro firm, it's what goes on in the overall structure. Everybody needs to be aware of that and needs to be aware of how important getting that structural engagement right is in terms of the sustainability. But turning to what the tupis actually do, my apologies, I'm an academic, so I talk like this. But basically what I'm trying to say in this slide is very similar to what Kaj has said both in the video and in what he said very briefly. Our findings strongly suggest, fundamentally, what supports effective action in relation to tupis is actually very similar to what we know supports the effective action of health and safety reps, whether they operate from inside or outside the workplace. Okay? There are other special things that help tupis, but fundamentally, these are trade union representatives, and they're acting like trade union representatives, making allowances for the context in which they're acting, but fundamentally, that's what they're doing. They tend to be confident, well-trained, and well-informed, experienced representatives. They use a mixture of political, legal, and technical skills in the ways that they approach their tasks. And they're most likely to have some chance of influence health and safety outcomes from and their engagement with both workers and owner-managers when they do this. Okay? You could take that text from any kind of report that, well, anyone that I've written anyway, over the last 20 or 30 years, applying to health and safety representatives everywhere, okay? They are change agents, they are knowledge activists, they are fundamentally trade union activists who link technical, political, legal, and social skills and experience in order to be effective. Tupis are the same, okay? But yes, in addition to that, and of course, what that means is that in order to be like that doesn't happen just as an act of God or whatever. It requires a lot of support. And to get that support requires resources, okay? These people, these tupis, the ones that we have met in this study, almost universally, well-trained, experienced, well-resourced, knowledge activists. In addition, they're successful when they're sensitive to the situation of workers and owner-managers in small and micro firms. Kaj has referred to them several times as intruders. They are perceived as intruders by owner-managers and indeed sometimes by workers in small firms. One of the key findings about micro and small firms in the general research on them is that they don't like intruders. Okay, so there's a big job to be done to convince the micro and small firm owner-manager particularly that actually this intrusion is useful to them. But what's really significant about the successful tupis schemes that we've looked at is that the tupis have done that. They have convinced the owner-managers, and they are often used by owner-managers as a source of guidance for themselves. Okay, they're not resisted as extensively as one might believe if one listened to the political opponents of these kinds of schemes. And they need to be able to work with a wide range of stakeholders as well as workers and owner-managers, including the employers, organizations, OSH practitioners, regulatory inspectors, union officials themselves. So the tupis are essentially quite remarkable people with a range of skills that, although similar to those that are found in successful health and safety representatives generally, are particularly focused on the needs of workers and owner-managers in micro and small firms. And the other key thing to bear in mind by now, you've probably got the message, that this tupis have similarities. Tupis schemes have similarities with what has been shown to work in other interventions. Tupis are change agents. They meet many of the criteria of success that wider research on interventions, intermediaries, and health and safety has shown to be necessary for their effectiveness. This points to their potential to play a significant part in the coordinated strategies of support that I referred to earlier. But, and this is an enormous but, I'm afraid, there appears to be little appetite for this evident in national level health and safety policies and plans at the present time. Leaving aside the few countries where we have found successful tupis action already fairly well embedded, you do not find this discourse going on at a political level anywhere else. So, to conclude, I've said it several times, the video has said it, Kai has said it, tupis are effective. If you don't take anything else away from this meeting, please take that home with you. If you are a tupa, if you are involved with tupa schemes, be assured that you are being successful. Okay? And what makes you successful, I've tried to point out. The regulatory steer is important. Funding arrangements are important. Cooperation with other actors is important. Active union support is important. And individual skills on the part of tupas are also fundamental and important to success. So, tupas, I would argue, and indeed the comparative report argues, that they have an enormous potential to play a significant role in supporting health and safety in micro and small firms, which is a location where such support is urgently needed. But the reality is they are actually a very limited presence, and in only a few countries has there been any significant progress over the last 20 years. I was the author of the ETUC report in 2002, so I'm fairly familiar with what the situation was at that time. And I would have to say that although there have been some changes in some countries since then, by and large, the overall picture is pretty much the same, which doesn't say very much for the potential being enacted in practice. And I think this is a key issue that we perhaps need to reflect on during the course of the day, and a strong message emerge from this workshop as a result of that. Major issues of reach and sustainability remain. They remain for health and safety in micro and small firms everywhere anyway, across a whole range of other kinds of support. So tupas are by no means unique in this inability to really make a splash at this point. But significant challenges include the political will to support them in national policies. I think there is a significant challenge also in terms of achieving commitment for trade unions to ensure their effective delivery. It's not obvious why trade unions should do this when their membership in micro and small firms is so low, where organizing strategies show that success is much better when you have a critical mass to achieve that success within. So, from a pragmatic point of view, some trade unions need convincing that looking at supporting tupas is actually a useful thing for them to be doing in these very difficult and critical times. I think we need to accept that. Ensuring the relevance of tupas to the changing world of work and employment is also significant and important and a serious challenge. One of the problems that we confront in the modern economy, as I'm sure you're aware, is this notion of the fragmented and fissured workplace, the idea that the traditional contract of employment around which labour relations has evolved is no longer quite as traditional as it used to be. That also affects how we think about tupas. And micro and small firms are in the forefront of that. They are the ones where insecure work and where all of this fissured and fragmented stuff is really going on. And so they are at the ends of the supply chains that produce these kinds of conditions. And so there are major challenges in supporting trade union action to prevent accidents and ill health in such situations. And then significant challenges remain to achieve cooperation for the key actors involved without compromising the trade union representative function. Okay? One of the things that you find very commonly stated by the opponents of this type of action is, oh, well, they are trade unions. We don't want trade unions near this place. We don't want trade unions destroying our business relations, our harmonious sort of situations or whatever. And often the supporters of tupis-type schemes have to spend a lot of time convincing the possible supporters of these schemes that they are actually beneficial. At the same time, they're not agents of employers. They're not agents of the industry. They're not agents of the small firms associations. They are trade union agents, and they have protective functions in relation to supporting workers who are in difficult scenarios in these kinds of situations. And we have evidence from some countries of the successful way in which tupis individually have been able to combine these supports. So it can be done. But it's important to remember that it needs to be done. And so, yeah, in terms of what's needed, I would say, to echo my film star colleague here, tupis are the best, but they are still quite rare in Europe. And what can we do nationally and in the EU to promote and make them somewhat less rare? Political recognition of the need for health and safety support for micro and small firms, recognition of the importance of worker reps in local health and safety management, union resources and priorities to policies to reach and support micro and small firm workers, and in relation to the broader role of union strategies to support workers in micro and small firms. I think the key thing here is the need to influence broader policy rethinking on the distribution of resources. I've said earlier that although there are resource implications for these tupis schemes, that doesn't mean that these schemes cannot be demonstrated to be very cost effective. But somebody needs to do that demonstrating and to encourage policymakers to rethink the way they regard the acceptability of inequality in the distribution of workers' exposure to risks. Because what we're saying here is that workers in micro and small firms are exposed to risks of harm to their health and to their safety disproportionately when compared with many workers in larger organizations. This inequality needs to be addressed. And tupis are an effective means of doing that. So policymakers need to think in those terms if they are going to remove these burdens which they claim to be desirous of removing at the European level. So on that note, I'm going to shut up. Thank you.
Well, we have a short time. Tenemos 10 minutos para preguntas o comentarios a lo que han expuesto Kaj y David. Y aparte me dicen que os recuerde que hay que firmar la hoja de asistencia que está fuera. Entonces, las personas que no la hayan firmado todavía, que cuando salgan al café, por favor, que se acuerden de firmar. ¿Vale? Y nada, a ver si alguien quiere decir algo, comentar algo o preguntar algo.
Hola, soy Berta Chulbi, soy periodista. colabora con ISTAS y ESAMAG, y quería hacer una pregunta en relación a los países no estudiados. Es decir, ¿qué ocurre en Francia, por ejemplo, o en Alemania? Que me estaba preguntando esto mientras vosotros estabais hablando y estoy segura que tenéis alguna información. Entonces, mi intriga es esa. ¿Qué pasa en esos países que son tan próximos a nosotros, así a grandes rasgos?
Okay, thank you. We chose the countries that were included in the study because we already knew that something was happening in those countries by and large, at least as far as the 4 countries that we focused on is concerned. As far as I'm aware, in virtually all the other European countries, there are no formalized schemes in place, such as the ones that we've been talking about today. There are a number of countries that have voluntary and short-term similar types of initiatives. They've existed in France, in Denmark, in 1 or 2 other European countries I can think of. But I think it's fair to say that in general, the countries that we focused on within the EU are the ones where these schemes are most obvious. There are other types of schemes in some countries that where trade unions are involved in providing advice and information to workers in micro and small firms, but not in this way of having trade union prevention agents visiting firms. So there are observatories, for example, in France that the unions have organized, which do provide advice and information to small firms. But that's not quite the same thing as we've been talking about here. There are other countries outside of the EU that have similar kinds of schemes. Norway, for example, have schemes certainly in some sectors which are very similar to the Swedish scheme that you've heard about, and they've had them there for some considerable time. And in other countries beyond the European Union, there are some similar examples I know of in South Africa, for example, in New Zealand, but again, on a fairly small scale. I hope that answers your question.
Well, I would just add a little bit. You might know it more, David, but in Germany, for example, the workers' compensation insurance systems is very active. They have advisors and supported by law going around to employers advising on health and safety. But given the reality that in Germany too, 99% of all employers are small or especially micro, their effective reach of micro and small firms is quite limited. And in France, you have formally a rather strong legal system for occupational health services. And what that amounts to in practice in small firms, again, as far as I know, is fairly limited.
And just to add to what he has said, just to remind you that the schemes that Kai has just mentioned are not trade union prevention agents.
Perdón. Soy Vicente López, gerente de ISTAS. Entonces, cuando escuchaba el trabajo que habéis hecho, que es muy interesante, estaba pensando también ya no tanto en el modelo de pequeña empresa, que me recuerda más a un modelo industrial que está a punto de, o está cambiando continuamente, sino a los problemas de segmentación de mercado de trabajo. Los tupas también podrían servir para enfrentarse a realidades como el trabajo a domicilio, como el teletrabajo, o sea, el trabajo de teletrabajo, o como otras realidades que en estos momentos significan una un paseo de los trabajadores fuera del centro de trabajo, es decir, porque estamos ante la idea de que la relación face to face, ¿no? la relación directa en el centro de trabajo es importante, pero cada día el centro de trabajo ha perdido más consistencia. Casi podría ser un proyecto, otro proyecto, ¿no? Para el año que viene, ¿no? ¿no?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that one of the big challenges for the tupis type initiative, as I said in my presentation, is how do you use this kind of initiative to address the recent changes, the fissuring that has taken place. You call it segmentation, I've called it fissuring. We're talking about the same thing. And it is becoming increasingly challenging to traditional approaches to representation. And after all, tupis are essentially building on the traditional approaches to representation. We know that, again, for the vast majority of micro and small firms, they still have workplaces, and there still is a role for tupis. But we also know that that role has some limitations, and this is something that the present study doesn't really address, and it is definitely something that needs to be looked into for the future.
No, I can add that Swedish trade unions and regional safety reps are trying a bit to address it, not with a huge success. But the transport workers unions are trying to work with Uber, Foodia, and the gig economy. Against quite a resistance from the coordinating platform firms who don't see themselves as employers, but with some few successes. And white-collar unions are also trying to organize and work with the health and safety for consultants and so on who work from home. And again, with some success, but against much difficulty. So let's say it is recognized, and general coverage of regional safety reps in Sweden is a political contested. Unions want to increase the coverage, partly to cover these type of forms of work, but let's say the employers are resisting it, and the politics is not really supporting any extension of their coverage.
¿Querías decir algo más o...?
No, simplemente quería saber si hay algún ejemplo, pero Frick ya me ha dicho un poco el ejemplo sueco, y bueno, pues si hubiera, igual valdría la pena, ¿no? Visibilizar algunos ejemplos exitosos para poder ver la posibilidad de expandirlo a nivel europeo, ¿no?
¿Hay otras preguntas o intervenciones?
Paweł Marciniak z Polski, Poznań, firma Bristol, społeczny inspektor pracy. Była tutaj mowa o szkoleniach, które przechodzą inspektorzy tupis, i pytanie jest takie, czy inspektorzy przechodzący szkolenia, czy oni są ukierunkowani typowo branżowo, czy mają wejście do wszystkich przedsiębiorstw, wszystkich branż? Jak to wygląda? Dziękuję.
Well, I think what both Kai and I have said is that in our studies we concluded that the training is really important. Yeah. So how that training is done varies enormously between different countries and different tupis schemes. But one of the things that is very important to the success of the tupis schemes that we looked at is very much connected to their sector industry type focus. So the employers in the micro and small firms recognize the tupis as having relevant knowledge and skills that are relevant to their work. That's quite important. At the same time, in the training, it's also very important that tupis are supported in their understandings of how to carry out their role as trade union knowledge activists. And so, in that sense, they need a broader training and a broader understanding of how to be an effective workplace representative. And it's less important which sector they are being trained to engage with. I think what I'm trying to say here is that there are a set of skills that tupis possess. Some of those skills are quite specific to the types of industries in which they are engaged. But many of the other skills are not specific to that industry, but specific to the role of being a representative. So I would say that any training of tupis needs to take account of both those things.
Let's say what we found are the different types of tupis around the 4 countries where we have the examples. Let's say most of them are sector specific, but some of them are more general. When those who are more general are rarely also, they are covering most sectors, but not construction, and so on. So it varies. But to be more concrete, Thomas Kohlberg, you are a regional safety rep in construction, and I think you had 10 or 12 years experience of being a local safety rep, something like that? Oh, sorry.
Yes, that's right. I've been a local safety person in a local firm in Sweden, in Stockholm, in about 10 years before I've been a regional safety person in the union. And I meet larger and smaller firms and lots of self-employed today we work with.
Yeah. What it means is that those who are appointed to tupis, they nearly all of them have a lot of experience. One is interacting with managers, which means also understanding the position of manager, understanding the production, understanding the difficulties in the economy and of the production. And they have a lot of experience working with health and safety. On top of that, they get the training, what David talks about, coming as an external outsiders, and also mostly extra training in health and safety issues and health and safety regulation. But their experience of being safety reps in local workplaces is essential, because that's giving the basic competence to interact with manager.
Okay, I think it's coffee time now. See you in 30 minutes. And don't forget to sign the registration form, please.